When states affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018, they endorsed two critically important emerging norms. The first is the primacy of national ownership and leadership, that our responses to displacement should be guided by those closest to the phenomenon of displacement. The second is participation, that responses are most effective when they actively and meaningfully engage those they are intended to protect and assist, and that meaningful participation makes our responses more effective and more legitimate. These two principles have been at the core of our work since 2018. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic had a profound impact on our research, our training, and public engagement activities. Like so many, we were forced to pivot to do things differently. But it was in that pivot that we found the true power and potential of localization and refugee participation. Amplifying the perspectives of our partners was not only the right thing to do, but a good thing to do. That bringing the perspectives of our partners into sustained dialogue with global actors raised new questions, shared new knowledge, and brought new examples of innovation into global conversations. Remote technology enabled us to support the Dadaab Response Association, a community-based research organization run by partners living and working in the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya. In publishing their research as working papers, we were able to bring new questions about the barriers to refugee education to global discussions on one of the key themes of the 2019 Global Refugee Forum. But the value of inclusive dialogue on policy and practice, and the value of bringing localized knowledge and refugee perspectives into global discussions was most clearly illustrated by the webinar series we co-hosted with Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC. Our first webinar brought research partners from East Africa and the Middle East and refugee leadership into direct conversation with the special envoy of the Prime Minister of Canada on refugee and humanitarian issues. These perspectives highlighted the importance of inclusive and collective responses that engage with local realities.
These local systems that are weak are actually disadvantaging refugees more. So I think this is why it's very important to invest more time in thinking about what does development mean? How can we development across sectors? What does localization mean? How can we negotiate the issue of localization between the host government, but also the empowerment and strengthening of the refugee community?
Our webinar on refugee education brought partners from different regions into conversation on the impact of COVID-19 on refugee education, not only highlighting the very differentiated barriers faced by displaced learners, but sharing lessons on how to respond.
I'm trying to now figure out the schools in Canada or in US to have connection with the schools in Dadaab so that these students can get the much needed education that they really need it.
Our webinar on refugee participation brought refugee leaders from East Africa and the Middle East into direct conversation with colleagues from UNHCR and the Government of Canada to discuss how the role of refugee-led organizations revealed by the onset of the pandemic provided evidence of the complementary role of RLOs that they can play in an enhanced post-pandemic refugee response system.
It was during the peak of the pandemic situation. We were able to reach over 39,000 forcibly displaced persons in the countries in which we operate.
Our experience in the pandemic has taught us how remote technology makes this easier than we had imagined. These principles of localization and meaningful refugee participation are central to the GCR and at the core of LERRN's work. We pledge to continue to foreground our work in the perspectives and priorities of our partners closest to the phenomenon of forced displacement. And we call on all stakeholders to make this same commitment. I leave the last word to Mark Akello, Director of the Dadaab Response Association. When speaking at a recent webinar on building and sustaining research partnerships, Mark had this to say about the benefits of virtual participation, especially for partners like him who face so many barriers to their physical movement and the ability to travel.
As refugee researchers, our minds are not controlled. We feel very free, even though we don't move physically.